Most people say they want you to heal, but what they actually want is for you to heal in a way that remains convenient for them. They want you calmer, quieter, less reactive, but still available, still understanding, still willing to absorb discomfort so they don't have to face it themselves. This is the unspoken expectation placed on empaths more than anyone else. Grow, but do not change the structure of the relationship. That is why real healing shocks people, because it does not produce the empath they imagined. It produces someone they no longer recognize and no longer benefit from. A fully healed empath does not glow with endless warmth. They do not radiate reassurance. They do not lean in when others destabilize. Instead, they become still, observant, selective. And that stillness feels threatening to anyone who was unconsciously relying on their emotional labor. What most people call cold is simply the absence of self-erasure. This is where the fantasy of healing collapses. Healing is often sold as a return to softness, as if the goal were to sand down sharp edges and make a person easier to hold. But from a psychological standpoint, especially through the lens of Carl Jung, healing is not regression toward innocence. It is progression toward integration. And integration is not gentle. It is clarifying. It removes illusions. It reveals dynamics exactly as they are. When an empath integrates what was once suppressed, the anger, the discernment, the capacity to withdraw, they stop functioning as emotional infrastructure. They no longer stabilize unstable systems. They no longer compensate for emotional immaturity. They no longer translate chaos into comfort. And when that function disappears, people don't feel inspired. They feel exposed. This is why so many relationships change after an empath heals. Not because the empath became unloving, but because they became unavailable for misuse. The healed empath no longer negotiates boundaries through guilt. They no longer explain their instincts to people who benefit from misunderstanding them. They no longer stay present to prove loyalty. Their presence is no longer a guarantee, it is a choice. And choice is destabilizing to those who relied on obligation. There is something else most people miss about this transformation. The empath was never blind. They were never unaware. They saw the patterns long before healing began. They sensed the manipulation, the imbalance, the subtle extractions of energy. What kept them stuck was not ignorance, but hope. Hope that understanding would be reciprocated. Hope that endurance would be rewarded. Hope that love would eventually become mutual. Healing ends that hope, not in bitterness, but in clarity. The empath stops waiting for people to meet them where they are. They stop overfunctioning to preserve connection. They stop translating behavior into excuses. And once that happens, the relationship can no longer operate on its old terms. This is why a fully healed empath often feels dangerous to certain personalities. Not because they attack, expose, or dominate, but because they withdraw their emotional supply without warning and without drama. They don't argue. They don't confront. They don't seek closure. They simply disengage from dynamics that require their self-sacrifice to survive. Their power is not in reaction, but in absence. Healing, then, is not about becoming softer. It is about becoming precise. It is about knowing exactly what belongs to you and what does not. It is about no longer mistaking endurance for virtue or empathy for obligation. The healed empath does not harden. They condense. They become less diffuse, less accessible, and far more self-contained. And this is the part that most people do not expect. Healing does not make the empath more available to the world. It makes them sovereign within it. They do not announce this shift. They do not justify it. They do not explain it. They simply stop participating in dynamics that once depended on their silence. What a fully healed empath turns into is not kinder, nicer, or easier to love. They turn into someone who can no longer be unconsciously used. And for those who benefited from their former openness, that change feels like loss, even though what was lost was never love to begin with. The first visible change that unsettles people is not the empath's boundaries. It is not their silence. It is not even their withdrawal. The real disruption begins when the empath stops absorbing what others project and starts reflecting it instead. This is what creates the mirror effect, and it is the moment when familiar dynamics begin to fracture. For most of their lives, the empath functioned as an emotional sponge. When someone was anxious, the empath carried it. When someone was angry, the empath softened it. When someone felt inadequate, the empath compensated. This absorption kept relationships stable, but it also kept them dishonest, because the empath was quietly editing reality for everyone else. Healing ends that editing. A fully healed empath no longer metabolizes emotions that do not belong to them. They no longer translate manipulation into misunderstanding, cruelty into stress, or neglect into confusion. They do not take responsibility for emotional states they did not create. Instead, they allow those states to remain exactly where they originate. And when that happens, people are forced to encounter themselves without distortion. This is the mirror effect. The empath does not accuse. They do not confront. They do not explain. They simply stop cushioning the impact of another person's inner world. And that absence of cushioning feels like exposure. What makes this moment so powerful is its neutrality. The healed empath is not trying to teach a lesson. They are not seeking justice. They are not attempting to induce guilt or shame. They are simply no longer participating in emotional distortion. And that clarity is intolerable to anyone whose identity depends on avoidance. This is why manipulators react so intensely at this stage. When the empath was absorbing projection, manipulation felt effective. When the empath was doubting their own perceptions, gaslighting worked. But once the empath trusts their internal knowing and stops buffering reality, manipulation loses traction. There is nothing to push against, nothing to hook into, nothing to destabilize. The manipulator sees themselves clearly for the first time, not because the empath exposes them, but because the empath stops hiding them. And this is where the accusations begin. You've changed. You're cold. You're selfish. You're not who you used to be. These statements are not observations, they are confessions. They reveal the exact function the empath used to serve. From a psychological standpoint, what is happening here aligns precisely with what Carl Jung described as the withdrawal of unconscious participation. When the empath disengages from carrying the shadow of others, that shadow does not disappear. It returns to its owner. And most people experience that return as aggression, discomfort, or loss. The mirror effect is especially destabilizing because it removes the empath's most exploitable trait, self-doubt. The healed empath no longer asks, am I overreacting, or maybe I misunderstood? They do not seek confirmation for what they already perceive. Their internal authority replaces external validation. And without that doubt, manipulation has no entry point. This is why conversations suddenly feel flat or tense. The empath no longer over-explains to maintain harmony. They no longer perform emotional labor to keep others comfortable. Their responses become brief, precise, grounded, not defensive, not appeasing, just factual. And for people accustomed to emotional leverage, this feels like rejection. It is important to understand that the mirror effect is not an act. The empath is not doing something new. They are simply no longer doing something old. They are no longer absorbing emotional excess. They are no longer smoothing psychological rough edges. They are no longer translating dysfunction into palatable narratives. What remains is raw interaction without distortion. For healthy individuals, this clarity is stabilizing. They feel seen without being managed. They feel respected without being rescued. They adjust. They take responsibility. They engage differently. But for individuals who relied on the empath's self-erasure, the mirror effect feels like abandonment. This is why the healed empath often becomes the silent catalyst for relational collapse. Not because they provoke conflict, but because they stop preventing it. They allow tension to exist. They allow discomfort to surface. They allow truth to disrupt the structure. And systems built on avoidance cannot survive that exposure. The mirror effect marks the point of no return. Once the empath stops absorbing, the relationship can no longer operate as it once did. There is no way to unsee what becomes visible. There is no way to restore a dynamic that depended on unconscious sacrifice. This is why many relationships end quietly at this stage, not with arguments, but with distance. The empath does not announce this shift. They do not threaten. They do not negotiate. They simply remain present without distortion, and that presence acts as a psychological mirror. People either step into responsibility or they step away. That is the true power of the mirror effect. It does not punish. It does not correct. It reveals. And revelation is far more destabilizing than confrontation ever could be. A healed empath does not feel dangerous because they attack. They feel dangerous because they no longer need anything from you. And to a narcissistic personality, that absence of need is not neutral, it is destabilizing. Narcissistic structures are built on asymmetry. Someone must want more. Someone must care more. Someone must react. When that imbalance disappears, the entire system loses coherence. The narcissist does not fear confrontation. In fact, they often thrive on it. Conflict provides stimulation, validation, and emotional fuel. What they fear is irrelevance. They fear emotional neutrality. They fear the moment when their presence no longer creates a response. A healed empath represents exactly that moment. They are not provoked. They are not impressed. They are not pulled into cycles of explanation, defense, or emotional negotiation. And without those cycles, narcissistic control collapses. What makes this particularly threatening is that the healed empath sees the mechanics clearly. They recognize projection in real time. They notice the subtle shift from charm to entitlement. They observe how admiration is used as currency and guilt as leverage. But unlike before, they do not expose these patterns emotionally. They do not argue about them. They simply disengage. And disengagement deprives the narcissist of their primary source of regulation. From a psychological standpoint, the narcissist relies on external regulation to maintain internal stability. Their sense of self is fragile and requires constant mirroring, reaction, and reinforcement. The empath once provided this unconsciously through reassurance, forgiveness, emotional availability, and self-doubt. Healing removes that supply. The empath stops feeding the structure that kept the narcissist coherent. This is why narcissistic individuals often escalate when they sense this shift. They increase charm, then criticism. They alternate affection with withdrawal. They provoke guilt, urgency, or fear. These are not random behaviors. They are attempts to restore emotional dependency. But the healed empath does not respond to these signals. They recognize them as mechanisms, not messages. And mechanisms only work when the target reacts. The most destabilizing aspect of a healed empath is not their boundaries. It is their internal authority. They no longer outsource reality. They no longer ask others to confirm what they already perceive. This removes the narcissist's ability to rewrite narratives. Gaslighting fails when the empath trusts their own perception more than external explanation. Emotional manipulation fails when there is no hunger for approval. This is where the narcissist experiences what feels like loss of power. Not because the empath takes power away, but because power was never inherent. It was borrowed. It existed only through the empath's participation. When that participation ends, the illusion dissolves. And illusions, once exposed, cannot be rebuilt in the same form. Carl Jung described this dynamic through the lens of projection and shadow. When the empath withdraws, the narcissist is forced to face aspects of themselves that were previously managed externally. Their insecurity, envy, emptiness, and rage no longer have a container. They experience this as abandonment, betrayal, or cruelty, even though what has actually occurred is psychological separation. This is why healed empaths are often labeled as cold or heartless. These labels are defensive constructions. They allow the narcissist to avoid confronting the real threat, that the empath is no longer emotionally accessible. The healed empath has not lost empathy. They have gained discernment, and discernment feels merciless to those who depend on confusion. A healed empath does not seek to dominate the narcissist. They do not seek revenge. They do not need to win. Their power lies in refusal to react, refusal to explain, refusal to remain available to dynamics that require self-sacrifice. This refusal is quiet, but it is absolute, and it removes the narcissist's final leverage. This is the paradox. The empath becomes dangerous precisely because they are no longer engaged in power struggles. They are no longer invested in outcomes. They are no longer trying to be seen, chosen, or understood. And without that investment, there is nothing to manipulate. The narcissist is left alone with their own internal chaos. In the end, what the narcissist fears is not the empath's strength, it is their independence. It is the realization that the empath can walk away without anger, without explanation, without collapse, that they can exist fully without the narcissist's validation, that they no longer orbit the narcissist's emotional gravity. That is why healed empaths feel dangerous. Not because they destroy, but because they detach. And detachment is the one thing narcissistic psychology cannot survive. The collapse does not begin with confrontation. It does not begin with arguments, ultimatums, or dramatic exits. It begins quietly, at the exact moment the healed empath stops functioning as a structural support. Toxic systems do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because the one person holding them together steps aside. For years, the empath served as the load-bearing element. They absorbed tension so others would not have to face it. They translated dysfunction into tolerance. They smoothed over fractures that should have demanded repair. Families stayed intact, relationships persisted, and workplaces remained functional not because they were healthy, but because the empath compensated for what was broken. Healing removes that compensation. Once the empath withdraws their emotional labor, the system is forced to reorganize. And reorganization is not gentle. Conflicts that were previously diffused now surface. Power imbalances that were quietly managed become visible. People who relied on the empath's silence are suddenly exposed to consequences they never had to face. What appears as chaos is actually reality asserting itself. This is why the empath is often blamed when the system begins to crack. From the outside, it looks as if the empath changed and everything fell apart afterward. But the sequence is misunderstood. The empath did not create the instability. They simply stopped preventing it. Toxic systems survive on denial. When denial is removed, collapse is inevitable. In psychological terms, this mirrors what Carl Jung described as the breakdown of compensatory structures. When one individual carries the unconscious weight of many, the collective appears stable. When that individual individuates, when they reclaim their energy and withdraw unconscious participation, the collective must either evolve or disintegrate. Most toxic systems choose disintegration. This is why patterns intensify before they end. The family member who depended on the empath's mediation escalates. The partner who relied on guilt tightens control. The workplace that exploited flexibility suddenly enforces rigid expectations. These are not signs that the empath made the wrong choice. They are signs that the system is struggling to survive without its stabilizer. What follows is a revealing split. Some individuals adapt. They take responsibility. They confront their own behavior. They meet the empath as an equal rather than a container. These relationships often deepen and become more authentic than before. But others cannot adapt. They externalize blame. They rewrite history. They recruit allies. They label the empath as the problem. This response is not personal, it is structural. Systems that cannot self-regulate must locate a scapegoat. The healed empath does not intervene in this collapse. They do not manage perceptions. They do not defend their intentions. They do not rush in to restore peace. They observe. And this observation is not passive. It is conscious disengagement. By refusing to resume their old role, they allow the truth of the system to fully reveal itself. This is the point at which many empaths feel guilt, not because they have done something wrong, but because the collapse feels cruel. Years of conditioning taught them that stability was their responsibility. Healing dismantles that belief. It reveals a harsher truth. Stability built on self-erasure is not stability. It is postponement. As the system collapses, something else occurs. The empath's nervous system recalibrates. They experience less anxiety, not because circumstances improved, but because their body is no longer regulating chaos for others. Their clarity increases. Their energy returns. What once felt like abandonment now feels like relief. This shift confirms what was previously only suspected, that the cost of maintaining the system was their own vitality. In the end, toxic systems collapse for a simple reason. They were never designed to function without extraction. When extraction stops, there is nothing left to sustain them. The healed empath does not destroy these systems. They reveal them, and revelation is irreversible. This is why healing is so disruptive. It does not preserve structures that depend on unconscious sacrifice. It forces a reckoning, and while that reckoning feels catastrophic to those who benefited from the imbalance, it is the first honest moment the system has ever faced. The collapse is not the empath's failure. It is the system's truth. Healing does not return the empath to who they were before the damage. That version of them was not healed. It was unconscious. It survived by adapting, absorbing, and disappearing. What emerges after real healing is something entirely different. Not a softer self, not a nicer self, but a sovereign one. The sovereign empath does not negotiate their reality. They do not plead to be understood. They do not explain their boundaries in the hope that someone will finally respect them. They no longer mistake emotional endurance for virtue or self-sacrifice for love. Their clarity has replaced their hope, and that clarity changes everything. This is what most people do not expect. The healed empath does not seek closeness at any cost. They are no longer afraid of distance. They can walk away without rage, without speeches, without collapse. Their nervous system no longer equates separation with danger. And because of that, they are no longer easily bound. From a Jungian perspective, this is the culmination of individuation. Carl Jung described individuation not as perfection, but as wholeness, the capacity to hold opposites without splitting. The sovereign empath embodies this. They can feel deeply without drowning. They can see clearly without becoming cruel. They can be compassionate without abandoning themselves. This is why their presence feels different. They are no longer diffuse, no longer leaking energy, no longer scanning the room for emotional threats. Their empathy is no longer a reflex. It is a choice. And what is chosen carries far more weight than what is given automatically. The sovereign empath does not announce their transformation. They do not demand recognition. They do not attempt to correct the narratives others create about them. They understand something fundamental. People are revealed by how they respond to your boundaries, not by what they say about your change. And so, the empath watches, quietly, precisely. Some people adjust, they rise. They meet the empath with respect instead of extraction. These connections become grounded and real. Others fall away. They accuse, they distort, they retreat. And the empath lets them go without bitterness. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because they no longer betray themselves to avoid loss. This is the final shift. The empath no longer organizes their life around being needed. They organize it around being aligned. Their peace is no longer fragile. It is defended by discernment, maintained by distance where necessary, and protected by the simple ability to say no without explanation. The sovereign empath is not here to save anyone. They are here to live in truth, and that truth is uncompromising. Anything that requires your self-erasure to survive does not deserve your presence. Healing teaches this lesson quietly, but once learned, it cannot be unlearned. This is what a fully healed empath turns into. Not harmless, not hardened, but ungovernable, rooted, awake, and no longer available for unconscious games. After sovereignty is established, something subtle but irreversible happens. The empath no longer experiences life as a series of emotional negotiations. They stop scanning for approval. They stop preparing explanations in advance. They stop managing reactions that no longer belong to them. What replaces this constant vigilance is a quiet internal order, a sense that nothing essential is missing. This is where many people misunderstand the sovereign empath. They assume detachment means numbness. They interpret distance as withdrawal from life itself. But what has actually occurred is the opposite. The empath has re-entered reality without distortion. Their emotional field is no longer crowded with other people's unfinished business. And in that clarity, their perception sharpens. Relationships become simpler, not easier, but simpler. The empath no longer invests in potential. They no longer stay because of history, guilt, or imagined futures. They engage only with what is present and reciprocal. This creates a radical shift in relational economics. Instead of giving endlessly and hoping for balance later, the sovereign empath requires balance now, and most connections cannot survive that requirement. This is why solitude often follows healing, not as punishment, not as withdrawal, but as recalibration. The empath is not lonely in the way they once were. They are no longer surrounded by people, yet emotionally abandoned. They are alone with themselves, and for the first time, that feels safe. Silence becomes restorative rather than threatening. Stillness becomes nourishing rather than empty. From a psychological standpoint, this phase marks the full withdrawal from what Carl Jung described as projection-bound relationships. When projections fall away, relationships must be built on reality rather than fantasy. Many dissolve, a few remain. And those that remain are no longer driven by need, but by choice. The sovereign empath also experiences a profound shift in how power is perceived. Power is no longer something taken, defended, or negotiated. It becomes intrinsic. The empath does not seek influence, yet their presence influences. They do not assert authority, yet their boundaries command respect. This paradox emerges because they are no longer attached to outcomes, and detachment is the deepest form of leverage. There is also grief in this stage, not the dramatic grief of loss, but the quiet mourning of illusions. The empath grieves the belief that love required endurance. That understanding would eventually be returned, that if they gave enough, things would change. Healing does not erase this grief, it contextualizes it. It allows the empath to see that what was lost was not a future, but a fantasy. As this realization settles, the empath's identity stabilizes. They are no longer defined by contrast, no longer the good one, the understanding one, or the strong one. They simply are. And this simplicity confuses people who still define themselves through roles, masks, and emotional transactions. The empath's refusal to perform feels like rejection, even though no rejection has occurred. What emerges over time is discernment without bitterness, compassion without entanglement, love without self-negation. The sovereign empath does not close their heart. They refine it. They become precise with where they place their attention, their time, and their care. And precision is what protects depth. This is the long arc of healing that few talk about. Not awakening as a moment, but awakening as a sustained state. A life no longer organized around fixing, proving, or saving. A life oriented toward alignment. And alignment, once chosen, restructures everything quietly. The empath does not announce this phase. There is no declaration, no victory speech. The transformation is evident only in absence. Absence of chaos, absence of urgency, absence of self-betrayal. And in that absence, something rare becomes possible. A life lived without distortion. That is what follows sovereignty. Not isolation, but integrity. Not hardness, but coherence. And once coherence is established, there is no returning to fragmentation. The empath moves forward, not louder, not brighter, but unmistakably whole.